Alrighty, Mr. Monotone back on some more Warframe today. So in the previous video I did the teacher quest. Now while I liked the quest itself, I felt like it was a little lacking on the actual teaching department of modding, so I decided to dive into the complicated topic myself and try to explain how to mod to you guys. Will this be helpful for you, knowing how awesome I am at making videos and how this is my first guide ever? Probably not, but that's how I roll. For my explanations, I will be using Prime because I believe it has some stat numbers that are pretty easy to explain and showcase. What I want to start off with is mod capacity and mod polarity. Every frame, weapon, and companion all have a max of 30 mod capacity. This can be doubled to 60 with an Orcan catalyst for weapons and an Orcan reactor for frames and companion. When you insert a mod, it will take up the number of capacity as indicated at the top right of the mod. Grading mods makes them take up more mod capacity. Every mod has a polarity associated with it. The polarity can be seen next to the number of the mod capacity on the mod itself. There is Moderai, Vazaran, Naramon, Zenurk, and Umbra. If you put a mod with a matching polarity in the mod slot, its capacity gets cut in half, helping to fit more mods in. And if you put a wrong polarity mod in the mod slot, then the mod takes up more room. There's also formula, which you can find in actions, and it will allow you to change or add a polarity to a slot. Upgrading mods cost an escalating amount of Endo that depends on how many upgrade levels the mod has. You don't need to upgrade the mod all at once. You can go per level, which is recommended for the expensive mods. Endo is a valuable resource and takes some time farming, but new players will be okay. Now getting into some stats. Hovering over each stat will provide context of what that stat means. These top stats are very self-explanatory except for the Riven disposition. Riven mods are special mods that can only be equipped to a certain weapon. A higher Riven dispo means the stats of that Riven will be greater. Maybe at tier 4 I can get a max of 250% weapon damage on the Riven mod, while at a tier 5 I can get 300% to just throw an example out there. It's best not to worry about Rivens though because they're rare and just not needed. Starting with the first stat below damage, we have critical chance. A critical multiplies the damage of a shot by the specified critical damage amount. However, there are levels of crit. Tier 1 crits are yellow and range from 1% to 100%. Tier 2 crits are orange and start at 101% up to 200%. And Tier 3 and beyond are red and exceed 200% crit chance. So if my weapon has a 150% crit chance, then there is a 50% chance at getting an orange crit, with the rest of my hits being a yellow crit. What's the damage difference? Well, the damage is calculated as this formula right here. I'm just going to put on screen. But an example of that is if my crit damage is 5x, then a tier 2 will be 8x, and a tier 3 would be equal to 12x. Next up is talking about status. So there are 3 base status effects being slash, puncture, and impact. The base status effect can vary from weapon to weapon. Some have only impact and puncture, some have just puncture, some have none of the 3 and an element instead. When I damage a target, there is a percentage chance to apply a status effect, and what that status is depends on the weighting. So for Prime, we are weighted towards having slash because it's at 77 compared to the 16.5 of puncture and impact. When you apply a status effect to an enemy, it will be shown as a symbol just below their health bar. Status effects do unique, effects on their target and also affect specific enemy factions with more efficiency than others, and some with less efficiency. Here is a brief explanation of each status. So slash 1.5x damage to infested in armor, ignores armor, which armor reduces damage taken, and it causes bleed damage over time. Puncture is 1.5x damage to corpus and organ, reduces target's damage output up to 80%, and increases crit chance of damage taken by up to 25% with multiple stacks. And there's impact, 1.5x damage to Grineer, Kuva Grineer, and Scaldra. Causes the target to flail backwards, effect increasing based on stacks. On heavy units, it lowers their mercy kill threshold to 80% of total health with multiple stacks. And yes, status effects can be applied multiple times on the same target, making the effect more potent. Next up, we have the 4 base elemental statuses. Heat, 1.5x damage to an infested and 0.5x damage to Kuva Grineer. Sets enemies on fire, causing panic and reduces armor up to 50% temporarily. Electricity is 1.5x damage to Corpus Amalgam and Murmur. Chains between enemies, dealing damage over time and stunning them. Toxin is 1.5x damage to an armor. Damage bypasses shields and deals damage directly to health. There's Cold, which is 1.5x damage to Sentient and 0.5x damage to Tech Rot. Causes enemies to move and attack slower per stack and freezes for 3 seconds at 10 stacks. Increases crit damage by 10% on first stack with an extra 5% per stack and doubles when frozen. Those are our primary status effects, meaning they all are just a single mod. You can combine 2 of the same mod to increase damage and improve the status chance weighting of it, but you can also combine 2 different elemental mods and create a secondary status effect, of which there are 6. Gas which is heat plus toxin, 1.5x damage to infested Deimos and Tekrot, 0.5x damage to Scaldra, produces gas clouds that deal an AoE damage of 3 meters. Last is heat plus cold, 1.5x damage to infested Deimos and 0.5x damage to Corpus Amalgams, deals 30% of base damage after 1.5 seconds as an explosion, and at 10 stacks or death, the stacks deal damage simultaneously to enemies within 5 meters and staggers them. Radiation is heat plus electricity, 1.5x damage to Sentient and Murmur, 0.5x damage to Organ, causes enemies to attack everything nearby with their damage increasing up to 550% with stacks. Magnetic is cold plus electricity, 1.5x damage to Corpus Amalgam, and Tekrot with 0.5x damage to Narmer, increases shield plus aura guard damage up to 325% with stacks, and disables shield regen temporarily. When the shield or overguard breaks, deal electric damage for 3% of their max shield or overguard per stack with a guaranteed electric status effect. Viral is cold plus toxin, 1.5x damage to Organ, 0.5x damage to infested Deimos and Murmur, increases damage to health up to 325% with stacks temporarily. Corrosive, toxin plus electricity, 1.5x damage to Grenier, Kuba Grenier, Scaldra, and 0.5x damage to Sentient, temporarily removes up to 80% of their armor with stacks. Oh man, that was a lot, and I'm glad that's out of the way. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some weapons have different base elementals. So for Ignis Wraith, for example, it has heat as its base elemental damage, and that's it. Now this affects modding a bit. If I want to put on gas, for example, if I just put on a toxin mod, it will become gas. Now if I put on a cold mod with that toxin mod, I get viral plus heat. And then if I put on a third mod as electricity, I get radiation plus viral. So that's just an important note. Now there's just one more important thing to talk about for weapon modding, and that's additive and multiplicative damage. So looking at my Vasa Prime, if I equip Augur Pack, damage goes up to 209, which is an additional 90% damage. If I add an elemental damage or multi-shot mod, such as Deep Freeze, it increases the damage by 90% of the base damage plus our Augur Pact mod, meaning that it is multiplicative. For the most part, raw damage mods are additive, while multi-shot and elemental mods are multiplicative. Quick explanation on multi-shot, it simply adds an additional damage instance to your shot. So if you are at 2 multi-shot, you're basically shooting 2 bullets at the cost of 1. And those 2 shots have their crit chance and status chance as separate. So if my crit chance is 50%, there's a 50-50 shot as 1 bullet being a crit, and a 50-50 shot as the other bullet being a crit. And same applies to the status effect. Now if multi-shot is not a whole number, say it's at 1.8, that means there's an 80% chance that we will have a second damage instance with each shot. Also, another stat that isn't listed here is punch through, which simply means the distance a bullet can go through a target and hit a second target. So the greater the punch through you have, the more targets you could potentially hit. So going with mod setups, what is good to use? Well, we want to focus on our crit chance and damage, our status chance, multi-shot because it's better than raw damage, and we want to have viral plus heat on our weapons. Viral significantly increases our damage with almost all targets, even the infested Deimos and Murmur. Heat helps to reduce the target's armor if they have any, plus it can deal quite the burn damage. So our basic mod setup looks like this for most weapons. Now if you're a brand new player, you're not going to have most of these mods, and that's fine. You'll pretty much be slapping on whatever mod you get starting out. Now this is what you should be working towards, and it still really helps to know what status to focus on. Even just an unleveled viral and heat setup can help a lot. Now we do have a flex slot, in my case being the Lethal Torrent mod, although Lethal Torrent is pretty much the best mod for this flex slot. I just mean that we have our crit mods, our multi-shot, status, viral, and heat, which are the main mods of any build. But what about Hornet Strike, you may ask? That's taken care of with our Arcane. Arcanes are a little bit of a later game deal, but this is where our additive damage is. But what might vary from build to build? Well, if the weapon has poor crit chance, mostly if it's below 20%, and we're on a secondary, although RIP primaries because there are no crit chance primary Arcanes, we can use secondary iterate for our crit chance and replace what would be a crit chance mod with Hornet Strike. Also, if the crit damage is low, we may not mod for crit at all. Say if the crit damage is below 2x, then it may not be worth modding for. Now that I think we have a good understanding of gun modding, we can focus to melees. Melees have most of the same stats you see from our guns. The main difference is follow through and combo duration. Follow through is the percent damage we do if we hit more than one target in a single swing. So if we hit 2 enemies in one swing, that second enemy will take 70% of the damage the first one took. Now for combo duration, melees have a combo count that escalates up to 12x after getting a number of melee hits on targets. There's a small meter that decays, and if it's gone, you lose your combo count. We have with 5 seconds of combo durations on this Nami solo, and getting hits resets the duration. There are also ways of increasing duration with Arcanes or the Naramon focus tree. There's also heavy attack stats and slide attack and slam attack stats. Slam attacks have been nerfed pretty heavily and almost are not worth focusing on the majority of melees. There's a few here and there that can be pretty good for slam attack still, but for the most part it's just not quite worth modding for anymore. Slide attacks are good for sweeping motions and keeping your momentum, and heavy attacks do a lot more damage. So how do we mod for melee? Well, it's a bit more complex because of our combo count mechanic and that there are some really good mods here. It opens up great mods such as Blood Rush for way more crit chance. For the most part though, we want our crit mods, an additive damage mod, our range mod to help with hitting multiple targets, typically an attack speed mod because melees can be very slow, and we can either go with viral or the more popular option, which is electricity build because of the arcane melee influence, which makes it so that we do damage to large groups of enemies. In this case, we focus on our status a bit more and have a status damage mod. I'd probably swap Weeping Woods with an attack speed mod by the way on most frames. I was just using this with Valkyr, who has an ability that gives attack speed. Condition Overload is also something I should mention too. It can provide more damage than Prime Pressure Point potentially, but I go with Prime Pressure Point for the consistency. Another thing I should mention is the stance mod slot. The mod you put here is important because it affects the animation of your melee attacks. You want to go with a stance that has sweeping motions to hit multiple targets and keeps your momentum instead of slowing you down a bunch. Something I should mention is the Exilus slot. Exilus mods are little bonus mods that are more quality of life than anything. For the most part on guns, I don't use Exilus slots. Doesn't mean they're bad, they're just a nice little bonus. But on melees it is very nice because of Tennokai, which makes it so that you can perform a heavy attack and not consume your combo count. Next we do have the Parazon to mod, but it's not complex at all. You have 3 slots for mods that can do neat little things. These are 3 I use. I will say Power Drain can make a pretty good difference, but it still is kind of niche and I'm just not really going for finishers or mercy kills. And the last modding bit to talk about is for frames, because the rest we'll just briefly mention. Frame mod setups vary greatly and there are many options that you have, and before I go on more about modding frames, I just want to say that there are seriously a variety of builds that you can have for each frame. There is no like one correct answer, but continuing on, each stat is self-explanatory, but I do want to mention shield gating. Shield gating is a mechanic where when your shield depletes, you are completely invincible for a brief duration depending on your max shield capacity. Shield gate kicks in, the duration of it is also dependent on where your shield recharged to before gating again. So for my Wisp, if I only reached 185 shield before gating again, the duration will be half of 370 shield gate. Now moving on, how do you mod for frames? Well, we can preview the stats of our abilities and we have to decide what we can min-max stat wise, but we do have some basic, pretty standard mods that are on the majority of frames. Those mods are Continuity, Equilibrium, Flow, and Intensify, in which I have the upgraded versions of. Obviously, this build does not have Equilibrium or Flow, which I'll explain in just a moment. Flow extra duration feels nice to have, and you typically don't need a ton extra. Equilibrium and Flow help with our energy, as we want to make sure we don't struggle for energy, because abilities are great and a lot of the fun of the game after all. Then Intensify is usually because we want at least some strength. Range and efficiency, on the other hand, are what varies the most, I say. Some frames you can dump efficiency on no problem, like my Wisp here. The abilities don't cost much energy, so I can throw on blind range for that extra strength, which is very helpful for what Wisp wants to do, which is buff you and your allies a ton. Then I have some extra range because it helps with my shock mode and my breach surge. Also, I was able to give up Flow and Equilibrium because I do not struggle with energy on Wisp. It's all about looking at what your abilities do, planning what you want them to really do, and thinking about, can I upkeep my energy with this build? Quick mention of the Aura mod. This mod affects the whole squad you're with, so in my case, every squad mate gets growing power. Then there's also the Arcanes, in which most of the time you're probably going to be using Molt Augmented for the extra strength, and whatever other Arcane you want to help out with your build even more, or relieve a weakness. Just to quickly mention companions, each companion has the companion itself to mod out for and a weapon. The main difference between companions are their specific mods. For example, I have this Hound, which has some Hound specific mods. There is Dev Cube, which has specific mods for energy regen, and so on. When it comes to modding the weapon, I recommend a spec for priming, which is when the companion can apply a bunch of status effects to the target to make them way more vulnerable. Then there's also the Necromech, Arc Gun, and Arc Wing to mod out. Arc Gun is similar to modding as your weapons. The Necromech and Arcwing is kind of just throw on whatever, basically. You don't even need to focus on them a whole lot because they aren't used a ton in the game. Arcwing is probably used the most, but it's mostly just for moving around fast for the most part. Oh man, anyway, that was a lot to get through, and I more than likely missed stuff that you guys will point out in the comments. I'm tired, got like 5 hours of sleep. I'm editing this video now. See you in the next one. So one more thing that I forgot to mention would be railjacks and also mod augments. Mod augments are basically special mods that affect your abilities in unique ways, giving them either a complete overhaul or buff, or just a nice quality of life change. Then for railjack modding, say that it doesn't matter a whole lot what you use. The bigger thing that you should be focusing on are the intrinsics, as well as working on acquiring better parts, because that's what makes the big difference for your railjack. Also, getting crew members will help out a lot too.